So I'm returning here to this the cabinet, the Habana 1886 to 87 championship. It's less of a cabinet and more of like a very unique composite. I actually removed this from the frame and the matting earlier, just now, about an hour and a half ago, standing over some archival boxes with a butter knife, right? Us like surgically removing it from the matting that you see depicted here, so to speak, right? This was in the Christie's 2018 Golden Age of Baseball auction. Um, we have to look at this for what it really is, and so I want to do like a historical service, right, in the sense of fully exegeting it from its origins and really depicting it, right? I want to give this the level of depiction and recognition that it really deserves. Um, what this is showing predominantly and prominently is Saborin, right, who we discussed in the back there. I think he's the one that's standing with his hand on the shoulder toward the left with the darkened, it's very, very uh, black coat. He actually, I'll just pull this up because I have some notes. Money that he obtained from baseball actually ended up going to revolutionaries. Saborin funneled money that he made from baseball into the hands of revolutionaries, among them the poet and journalist Jose Marti. Spanish retaliated by banning baseball in some areas, and then he was eventually imprisoned, right? I think he was stealing ammunition from the Spanish. Died in the Spanish fortress Castillo del Hacha in 1897. Um, there's no when we're looking at this and we're looking at Cuban baseball, the political intersection of this document and artifact here can't be overstated because really what we're working with is the intersection between baseball and identity formation of nations, right? And we've been discussing this a fair bit, but this artifact really takes that thesis to the next level in terms of not only being an foundational origin level document of Cuban baseball proper, but being a foundational origin level document of the Cuban nation proper, right? This is a form of Cuban nationalism. Baseball in Cuba was so important because it was a so to speak a cultural alternative. It was something that was chosen by the native population of Cuba, right? It became a national sport under uh, or beneath as a sort of document of resistance the Spanish colonial culture, right? Which was, you could say, bullfighting was the Spanish colonial culture. Um, there's different. You see the change of mode. It's a you have a violent, very violent, often uh, murderously violent sport in bullfighting. And Cuba instead embraces baseball, which is an egalitarian, strategic, collective, collaborative institution as a cultural underpinning or undergirding. And with the uh, the liberation of the Cuban nation from Spain uh, in 1900, you have the integration of baseball at the same time as a political and national statement of collective identity. And in this year, 1886, slavery in Cuba is abolished. This is a simultaneously, you can see the tension of baseball being a professional sport reserved for Cuban elites and quote unquote white Cubans in the 1880s and 1890s, again, all the way up to integration at 1900. Um, you can see that in this document combined with the tension of the exact moment in which this document is created, which is this critical step of abolition of slavery in Cuba, leading up to the final definitive revolutionary movement, which ends up culminating in the end of the Spanish Empire in Spain. So the idea here is baseball, especially in a Cuban context, right? Because we look at America, baseball isn't like a key to the lock of the cultural, political, and social and national liberation of the United States. It's certainly the national pastime, but this is something that develops during the Civil War. This isn't developing during the Revolutionary War in the sense that it's a mass cultural movement. Um, the importance of baseball in Cuba globally, especially in terms of how Cuba communicates baseball across the Caribbean, and furthermore, how baseball is used as an identity construction mechanism, as a national collective revolutionary movement, spearheaded by none so significant and prominent as Saborin, right? Literally funneling money that he received from baseball into the hands of Jose Marti, the revolutionary, the Cuban revolutionary, and then himself being a revolutionary figurehead in the literal movement itself. And the function, as we discussed with the documentary papers that were signed by, I'm going to pull up his name so I give you the clearest information at all times. Yes, by Melendez, Enrique Melendez, who was a prominent go-between between the Spanish colonial empire and the Cuban organizational, political, collaborative, cultural powers of baseball as it became more and more and more prominent in the main city centers of Cuba in the 1880s into the 1890s. As you see in those documents, there's this assertion of Cuban political, national, cultural identity, and it's occurring through baseball. And this is a way of collaborating, gathering, communing, creating community and culture that is very specifically Cuban. And this was something identified by the Spanish colonial regime immediately, perhaps in a well-founded way, as dangerous, as a threat to the Spanish colonial regime, because not only do you have Cuban revolutionaries who are participating in the sport of baseball, such as Saborin, and then you go a little bit further and you understand that Fidel Castro and Guevara were involved. Even Guevara was involved with Martin Dehigo. And let me pull that up for you. I'm just going to give a little information. Dehigo meets Guevara in a restaurant in Mexico City, and he gives modest financial support to the Granma expedition, which launched Fidel Castro's overthrow of Batista. Castro was a pitcher at the University of Havana in the late 1940s and frequently attended baseball games at the stadium in Havana. In the very first days of his rule, pledged to underwrite debts of the Havana Sugar Kings in 1959. Baseball as a cultural force in Cuba signifies a foundation of national identity. I was trying to say national identity, and the formation of the national identity and the continuance of it. So you're looking at something really that's so foundationally distilled in the spirit of revolutionary Cuba, and then undergirds the entire 20th century of Cuba's political revolutionary upheaval in this continued attempt to establish and found its national identity. And it's in the most paradoxical and strange and perhaps ironic way that the United States' continued political involvement in Cuba is kind of haunted by this cultural movement that occurs in 1864 and 1865 with Guillo and his brother, Nemesio Guillo and his brother. They're obtaining of the knowledge and technology of baseball from the American South during the American Civil War when they're in school in the American South, and they bring that back to Cuba. This cultural exchange, or this movement of communication of the language of baseball that's occurring between the United States and Cuba, is such a strange entanglement that it's the foundation, it's the level and the layer, kind of the unspoken level and layer beneath all of the political attempts to assert power and control sugar and other forms of economy in Cuba as a resource for the colonial missions of the United States. Right, once Spain is removed from the picture regionally, the United States attempts to assert political power, control, and dominion. And this again is a tension that undergirds the establishment of Cuban national identity. So when we look at baseball, and baseball as a revolutionary political tool, right? A political tool of culture as a technology to assert national identity, to assert collective political national identity. An artifact like this, and perhaps this artifact alone, shows this movement. The way that this is styled is somewhat European in its composition, but what it's showing is the adoption of baseball as an assertion of cultural, political, and social pride. The inscription here is N.E. Maceo. And Maceo was a studio photographer in Cuba, perhaps the most renowned for his depictions and work with the other Maceo, right? So there are two Maceos, and he actually has a studio photograph of the second Maceo. Antonio. And so Antonio was a general in the Cuban Liberation Army, fought for the independence of Cuba in the 10 Years' War, and let's see. Yes, numerous battles in the first half of 1869 against the Spanish Royalist troops. And those are listed. Was put on trial in Haiti, tried to be murdered by the Spanish consulate based there. It's a very illustrious, storied life here. Settled in Costa Rica in the early 1890s. There were attempts to assassinate him right after his involvement in this Cuban liberation movement. And was in communication with Martí. And became into relationship with Martí in this this liberation movement at the end of the 1890s. So just an absolutely essential figure. And N.E. Maceo, the studio photographer, has a prominent cabinet of Antonio Maceo. So what I'm kind of circling around here is the intertwining of politics in baseball, particularly as it occurs in the foundation of emerging national identity out from under colonialism in Cuba. And that being perhaps the most significant formation and distillation of baseball and baseball as a revolutionary missive device in history. So perhaps it's easy to say there are specific moments in the baseball world historical timeline that signify on the field events or movements within the culture of baseball that transform how it's played or how it's displayed or how it's exhibited in terms of a specifically cultural significance. But when I look at this moment and I look at this artifact, what we're really looking at here is a declaration of independence, right? And it's a subtle declaration of independence if you don't look too closely, because baseball as a cultural form in the face of the Spanish colonial government, in this continued attempt, right, through Melendez, right, through these documents, all of which show and display this continued attempt to assert this burgeoning cultural identity, which is rising from the ground, from the grassroots of Cuba, in terms of the field that it's being played on, the language of baseball that is being expressed and transmitted through different communities, right? Through the establishment of teams, through the continual attempts to organize baseball, documents that show the creation of rule books, the logs of the history of the sport, the logs of statistics, famous players, right? This is well known in terms of histories of Cuban baseball, many of which emerge, such as the history by Raul Diaz Moro, which is the history of national Cuban baseball, and the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame, which is eventually established to log these. I'm looking for my charger. To log these feats and accomplishments and achievements in Cuban baseball history. This is the foundation of a national identity through a cultural archive and a cultural performance, which becomes a ritualized theater and a ritualized movement of gathering. And then the documentation of that, which is a history. And that when you document a history, you're documenting a history of a people because it's significant enough to be remembered. And who is remembering it and why? The burgeoning Cuban nation is remembering baseball, communicating baseball, transmitting baseball, because it's a way of gathering together, and it's a way of sharing the enjoyment of life and the passion of life. So this document is exactly that in the way it is organized, the thickness of the board on which this is printed, and the intricacy of the design, the painstaking care committed by Eni Maceo, right? In the process of constructing this document, this is the cutting edge of photographic technology in terms of the embossment and embellishment of the photographs, in addition to the way that they're constructed and organized on the board itself. This is one of the highest technology baseball artifacts that I've ever seen in terms of the care that's been taken to not only compose the photographs, but to compose the actual board and document itself. So what this says, again, in the subtle way of a declaration of independence, right, is we have built the cultural structure of baseball. And this is our way of remembering it. We're commemorating the 1886, 1887 dynastic champions of Habana, right? Many of these players whom were immediately inducted into the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame to be remembered, right? Including, and perhaps most prominently, Saborin, as a Cuban national cultural and political figure of the liberation of the nation itself. The transmission of political national identity and the construct of Cuban identity by throwing off the fetter of the Spanish colonial government through baseball is absolutely, essentially represented here in a way that no other document in Cuban baseball history I've ever seen is represented. And this distills to me absolutely the importance of the technology of baseball as a way of constructing identity, culturally collaborating, and in the grandest, broadest sense, bringing an entire nation, a national group of people together, or even a global group of people together under the banner of baseball as a political device and a statement of identity and a statement of shared information, shared culture. Um, and what this represents, again, is so radical because it's a revolutionary device in the case of Cuba. The adoption of baseball is perhaps first and foremost the assertion of Cuban national culture during a period of time where Spanish colonial laws, traditions, and constructs were the essence of what was permissible and legal within the nation of Cuba. This is it's a birth moment. It's a birth moment of Cuban national culture at the turn of the 20th century. And so when you have that collision course, that coalition of all of these different forces and factors, the Habana dynasty, the very beginning of photographic documentation in a powerful, artistic, historically significant way, the creation of this something like this, a very creative composite document on a firm board, which is meant to create a legacy, a dynastic effect, an effect that will carry through and reverberate through history as a preserved and preservable artifact. Um, the collision course of Guillo's bringing baseball back into a revolutionizing Cuba with the General Antonio Maceo, who then comes back around and interacts with Martí, right? Saborin, and then a century later, you have Dihigo who meets Che Guevara, and you have again another Cuban revolutionary moment with Castro, who perhaps is best known in many ways, even before that revolutionary movement, as a baseball player. When you look at that entwinement, that entanglement of baseball in Cuba and revolutionary political national identity, it's almost inseparable and indistinguishable. And so again, this is the power of baseball in Cuba that's perhaps tenfold of the power of baseball in the United States of America. And there's that hubris of the American perspective, which is baseball is our national pastime. Baseball began here. It was created here, and every single evolution it underwent occurred here. It's just not true. Because you look at a moment like this and a preservational document like this, the statement here is a cultural declaration of independence in the exact moment that the abolition of slavery occurs in Cuba. And then 10 years later, right, you have Saborin, who goes on to be a massive part of the way that the revolutionary movement in Cuba unfolds and is remembered, along with Jose Marti, right, in this moment where Marti is again is entangled, as we spoke about, with baseball. And I'll just reiterate it again, why we spoke about it. Yep. Saborin funneled money he made from baseball into the hands of revolutionaries, among them the poet and journalist Jose Marti. So that cultural declaration of independence, in my assessment, occurs first and foremost through the formation and development and unfolding of baseball. You have a document like this, which is a political statement of cultural memory, the institutionalization of cultural memory of Cuba as an independent nation, separate from Spain in its adoption of baseball as a cultural conflagration, a cultural assembly, a cultural communalizing device of national identity, which, as is so clearly stated furthermore in 1900, when the liberation occurs officially from Spain, that very moment, baseball is integrated. And in this very moment, 1886, slavery in Cuba is abolished. And at this time, there are multiple reports by journalists saying baseball has become an absolute fervor in Cuba. And throughout and through these documents, which are bureaucratically published from Enrique Melendez and the Spanish colonial government, there is a continued heightened sense, again, as is documented through journalists and historians, of Spain's concern for the adoption of this mass movement. Because, as Melendez says, there's going to be major crowds. We need a police presence. These are official events, and they become more and more and more organized and official as a ritual, as a cultural rite that is occurring beneath the surface of the Spanish colonial government, that the Spanish colonial government has to authorize or sign off on these events to occur. You can see the rising or ratcheting up of the political tension even just between 1886 into the early 1890s. Again, when baseball, there's this huge tension around baseball, and it has to be banned. It has to be pressed down and suppressed because baseball is a signifier. It represents the rising national Cuban fervor of a individuated cultural mass political identity, mass collective identity. And the assertion of that identity in the integration of baseball in 1900 is so profound in a Western hemispheric and even a world historical sense, because it's the integration of a cultural foundation in an emerging in an emerging, liberated from Spanish colonial environment that demands inclusion. You don't have anything like this in the United States. It takes the United States 200 years to even get to that point. No. Yeah, 200 years. Cuba does it immediately. Immediately upon its independence. Slavery is abolished 15 years before its independence. Immediately upon its independence, it integrates its most prominent cultural national event of meaning, of identity. It integrates the foundation of its culture. So Cuba in this is a radical, it's a revolutionary nation. It's a revolutionary emerging out from the underpinnings of Spanish colonial control, right? Enslavement of the native population, enslavement of black people, control of the resources of the nation. The first thing they do is open up the gates to baseball. And that's what this moment represents. This is the moment that is the crux. 1886, slavery is abolished, and Saborin goes on to be an essential figure in the Cuban national liberation movement in the war against Spain. 1886, 1887, the Habana dynasty in Cuban professional baseball had been so well established and so well cemented. This team was the height of Cuban professional baseball. And again, 5 of these players go on into the Hall of Fame, the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame. Several of them immediately, the moment that it's established, because of their performance and their skill, the legacy that they leave in the game. And that Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame is a product of the independence movement of Cuba and the establishment and assertion of the national identity as it is tied to baseball. When you have Guevara, you have D'Higo, you have Castro, you have every single political movement in the emerging, shifting vision of the national identity of Cuba and the attempt to establish the national identity of Cuba post-Spanish colonial and during the United States' attempted involvement to control resources and political power in Cuba. Baseball is there. It's the foundation. So this document, to me, right, you could just look at this and you could say this is a baseball document. But to me, this is not it's not even a baseball document. It's a revolutionary political declaration of independence created as a historical document as well as a work of art to portray and preserve this moment of the establishment and solidification and declaration of the Cuban national identity out from under Spain in this radically fomenting period between the 1850s to 1900, 1886 being a crux, a turning point with the abolition of slavery, depicting Sabourin, the most important political national figure to participate in baseball, and one of the most important political national figures pre-1900 in Cuba, for his participation and for his role in the independence of Cuba itself as a nation. This document here is saying this is our culture. This is our vision of culture. This is our aperture of culture, the technology through which we are asserting our identity as a liberation movement from Spain, away from the cultural mores of Spain and Spanish colonial identity. We are asserting this out from under as a grassroots movement from ourselves, as this is what we value. This is what matters to us. This is what we organize around, and this is what we preserve. Right? This is what we are creating. This is not what you are creating and imposing upon us, but this is what we are creating. The same year that slavery is abolished, 15 years before the independence of Cuba. During the height of pre-20th century baseball in Cuba, it's reached a full fervor, and the height of the dynasty of the Habana team, which wins multiple championships, participates in the first game in Cuba, the first professional game, and it's the first professional team. This is the team that's founded by Sabourin and Bayon and Guillo. This is the team. This is the origin team. And this is the origin document. The origin visual document, which is a representation of the fully formed and fomented Cuban national political device of baseball, which was born from the ground, grown from the grassroots, communication, establishment of organized teams, events, games, a professional league. This is all occurring within the rising Cuban national context. This is the creation of self. And so this document is that to me. This is a revolutionary national political document of liberation, identification, and declaration of independence. And you just don't see that. To me, this is the deepest root of baseball. This is the deepest potential of baseball, and this is the deepest strength and power of baseball. You just don't see it anywhere else. You don't see it in the United States. This is not how it unfolds in the United States. It's just a national pastime. In Cuba, baseball is a liberation movement. It's a national cultural identity mechanism. It's the formation and foundation of the nation of Cuba. It's the way of creating and imagining collectivity and community and nationality and the Cuban identity, even in the face of Spanish colonial control. And it itself through Sabourin, right? And then Sabourin by proxy through Martí in the engagement. It itself is that level of the real political change that's occurring. So that's what I got. I just think it's just beautiful, incredible document, and it shows us what is possible and what baseball really is, just so far beyond the idea of it, or even the practice of it, or the game of it. It just what its real potentials and what its real history is in terms of its real ability, what it has done, and what it really is doing. So there it is. Talk to you guys later.